I really would love for Kobek, the main athlete in this book, to read it because I do think like I am quite a cynical person, and I do think there's a bit of like that sort of like lighthearted hater mentality that I think he and I share. But what I'm gleaning, like before he played sports, he was really mean about athletes. He was like, "What's the point of this?" And I thought, and he's really funny about it too in his book. So I could see us having some fun banter. I would like to think we'd be friends, but
I
it's
love
kind of
that.
crazy to think about.
Welcome to The Stacks, a podcast about books and the people who read them. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and today I am very excited to welcome to the podcast Michael Waters. Michael is a journalist and author whose work examines the relationship between sports, identity, and history. His latest book, The Other Olympians, Fascism, Queerness, and the Making of Modern Sports, uncovers the untold stories of early trans and intersex athletes, highlighting how they navigated the complexities of gender and competitive sports during the 20th century, including the very controversial 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. Don't forget, our January book club pick is The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley. We will be discussing that book on Wednesday, January 29th with Jay Wortham. Be sure to read along and tune in. Quick reminder, everything we talk about on each episode of The Stacks can be found in the link in the show notes. If you love this podcast and you want inside access to it, now is the time to head to patreon.com/thestacks. When you join the Stacks pack, you will get a bunch of perks every single month, like bonus episodes, access to our Discord community. You get to be part of our mega reading challenge. And if you join before January 31st, you get access to my very, very cool, if I do say so myself, reading tracker, and you'll get a shout out on this podcast. I've been doing shout outs on this podcast for new members of the Stacks Pack since we started Patreon in 2018. But you know what? All good things come to an end. That perk is going to be no longer starting January 31st. So if you want to hear me read your name in my dulcet tones, now is the time to join. Head to patreon.com/thestacks. And now I get to do a shout out to our newest members of the Stacks Pack. Thank you to Megan Gebhardt, Anastasia Gorolova, Hillary Hubacker, Kathy F., Abs H., Deep D, Aloha Lisa S., Tamanata Cook, Lindsay Tamborello, Ashley Miller, Samantha Juan, Patty Reads a Lot, Adrian Wiley, Amy Kett, and Kai Escobar Sanhuesa. Thank you all so much, and thank you to every single member of the Stacks Pack. I could not make this show without you. Now it's time for my conversation with Michael Waters, the author of The Other Olympians. All right, Michael Waters, author of The Other Olympians, welcome to the Stacks. I'm so excited you're here today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
I have to tell you, so normally I try to stick with books in the year that they come out on the show for these kind of interviews, but I loved your book so much and I sort of fucked up and didn't read it until after it came out. And so I was like, I can't do it, blah, blah, blah. And then I was like, you know what? I love the book too much to just let it disappear into the 2024 ethos. So I'm thrilled to have you here in 2025. I'm assuming there'll be a paperback at some point this year, maybe. And so it'll still be relevant this year and beyond. But for people who don't know about your book, can you tell us in about 30 seconds what you did here?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you making an exception for this.
Yes.
So my book is a nonfiction queer history book, and it's essentially the story of this Czech sprinter named Zdeněk Kobek, who was assigned female at birth, played in women's sports for most of his career, and then after stepping away from sports in 1935, he announced that he was transitioning gender and would begin living as a man.
Okay. I am sure that I am not unlike many people who read this book who are like, wait, there were trans athletes in the 1930s? How did you come to this story? How did you know that there was a story here to write about?
Yeah, so my background is in queer history, and I spend a lot of my time just reading sort of random news articles from the early 1900s about queer folks generally. So I think to me, I wasn't quite as shocked as probably the average person is. I subscribe to this database called newspapers.com, which literally they just digitize many of the major newspapers. It's an incredible resource. And so I have spent a lot of time just literally typing in different keywords and phrases related to queer people in different eras. Because, every era would have their own kind of buzzwords to describe,
Mm.
like gay people, for instance. And if you kind of know the ways that these things were described, you can really find a lot. And so in the 1930s, we didn't have this concept of being trans. And so the way that like people who were moving between these gender categories were described, it would be as undergoing a kind of quote unquote sexual metamorphosis, and sort of other
Mm.
similar phrases. And so I was like looking up stuff related to that in the 1930s when I stumbled on this newspaper story that mentioned Kobek, who is this athlete who transitioned gender, who's really at the center of my book. And I think what struck me is I had read a lot of like local news stories about people cross-dressing, people transitioning in some way, maybe after like it would be discovered on their deathbed or something, or they'd even apply to have like their name changed on formal documents. Like there are plenty of local news stories throughout the early 1900s about
Mm.
transition and about the sort of expansiveness of what we would call gender today. What struck me about Kobek's story right away is just that he was like quite famous.
Yes, yes. That struck me too. When I was reading the book, I was like, wait a second.
Yeah, well, and it's because usually like this is mostly relegated to local news, and the fact that Kobek was an athlete who was prominent in Czechoslovakia at the time, but like maybe not world famous until he transitioned, and then his sort of gender transition just became like global news for a year from 1935 to 1936. And that was really striking because like he sort of became a way in which just like the world public and I'm focusing especially on the American public in this case were talking about and receiving gender and sort of like we're breaking down like, well, what does it mean to move between these categories, and perhaps like are these ideas of male and female like are they perhaps more permeable than the public would have thought? And so he really became a vehicle for the public in the 1930s to just like think about gender, which I found really fascinating.
Do you feel like, as far as his fame goes, relative to the media, I guess, then versus now, was it similar to a like Caitlyn Jenner situation? Was it that kind of like, holy cow, this is this huge thing that's happening? Or was it different? Was it received in different ways?
Yeah, I don't think it was quite the same full court press as
Okay.
like a Caitlyn Jenner situation. I mean, honestly, like, I think there was an element of like sensationalism to the way that he was covered. I think it was more
Yeah.
of like, here is this odd story out of Czechoslovakia more so than like,
Mm,
here is this athlete that everyone knows.
I see.
Um, and yeah, and so that was kind of the original tenor of the coverage. I mean, and then there's this moment in 1936, actually during the Berlin Olympics. So Kovac doesn't play in the Berlin Olympics, but he is invited to perform on Broadway in New York City.
Right.
And so he comes to New York, and there's like tons of tabloid reporters all over him. People are trying to take his picture and interview him. The New York Daily News is covering him left and right. And so he definitely was more than just sort of a one-off news item for even the American press. I think
Mm,
just his story was so perplexing, but I wouldn't say that like kind of everyone in America had heard of him as
got
of
it.
that year. I think if you read the New York Daily News or the New York Post, for sure.
Yeah.
um, and yeah, but there was this element of sort of like, what a wild thing that is happening, more so than like, here is this A-list athlete.
Yeah. I'm curious a little bit about, since you have your background in queer history, why did you want to write this book? Why did you want to spend time with Kobeck and the other and Mark Weston and other athletes and sort of this story? Because it's not just a story about the athletes; it also is a story about the Nazis and my personal enemy Avery Brundage, who I've hated for my whole adult life. I discovered what a monster he was years ago through Dave Zirin, the sports
Oh,
writer,
yes,
because
yes,
he's
yes.
like very anti IOC. And I'm just like sort of curious what it was about these athletes, and then also sort of the broader story where you said, you know what, Michael, sit down. We're gonna write this as a book.
Yes, Avery Brundage for sure, recurring bad guy, which
Yes.
actually was sort of helpful for the book too. Which is, I think, like, I think the reason that I wanted to do this in the first place is I really am interested in queer and sort of like scrambling people's timelines of queer history and perhaps just
Yes.
history generally, which is, I think it's really easy to assume that like queer history from like 1969 when the Stonewall riots happened up
Right.
until like maybe we'll just say 2016, is this like story of like linear, clean progress. And,
Mm,
before 1969, it was all kind of darkness and closeted people. And then after, it's like we slowly got better and better. And that's just so far from the truth. Like, I think
right.
when you look through the 20th century, you see these like pockets of like queer possibilities, and these ways in which like the public is grappling with like gender and sexuality. And I think really sort of fascinating in fascinating ways that we just kind of forget about now. And I really think there are just so many lessons in understanding all of these different moments in the queer past, and the fact that like someone like Kobek could exist and be written about in this way in the 1930s. So that's just like a general framing where it's like when I'm discovering these stories that I feel like challenge people's notion of how the queer movement has unfolded and how queer people sort of have existed in America. That's always really
Right.
gonna get my sort of like pique my interest. And then in this case of this particular story, and so you like Kobek is at the center of the story, and you also mentioned that there's a couple other athletes who transition gender who are part of this as well. One of them is a British field athlete named Mark Weston, who transitioned in the summer of 1936, shortly after Kobek, and actually married a woman a few months later, which was like a bit of a scandal in the UK. And, like, honestly, like, there was just so much structuring narrative behind just like the
Yeah.
actual story that happened, which you often don't get in queer history. The fact that there was like kind of a villain in the form of Avery
Yeah.
Brundage, who is this like Olympics official who kind of used Kobek's story to create these early like gender surveillance policies at the Olympics. Also, I think most key to this is Kobek wrote basically like this long series of personal essays about his life in 1936. And so it's like 40,000 words. It's basically a short memoir. And it's him narrating his life from birth. Like he actually does have a birth scene, which I'm sort of like, you weren't there for that. So,
How?
there's
Explain those
elements of it. Yeah,
memories.
exactly. There's some elements of it that are a little sensational.
Yeah.
But he explains like his whole life and his whole thinking, sort of his relationship to gender and his body, his relationship to sports. He like lays it all out there. And, when you are doing like any kind of marginalized history, especially pre World War II, that is so rare to get a document
Yeah.
like that from someone that was really like preserved by like there is so little sort of like archival memory of a lot of different marginalized folks, including queer folks. And so when I saw that, and I was like, this man literally wrote out his life story, and like
Hmm.
that is just like such an incredible document to really structure a book.
Yeah. So let me give you some context of my life. So I read this book kind of during the 2024 Olympics, right after I returned from a trip to Germany. So it was like exactly where my brain was. And it feels like right now, sports is sort of the frontier for conversations around transness and trans athletes, but also just like trans kids who want to play soccer, which
Yeah.
like like maybe maybe they consider themselves athletes, but like my kids are 5 and their soccer is like not really a sport. So I'm wondering if that's sort of the sense that you get, that like the framing of the Olympic, the great athletes is somehow being shaped in order to do the work of like fucking with kids and like fucking like if that I don't know how to frame the question exactly, but like if these elite athletes are sort of being used as a way to teach everyday people how to be transphobic and destroy children's lives.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I think on some level, I almost am hesitant to ascribe so much logic or
Okay.
forethought to like a lot of these like right-wing legislators who are really just trying to demonize trans kids. And I think what they've realized is that like sports is an issue where they feel like they just like have some kind of like talking point that resonates more broadly. And I also think that's just because people are sort of unwilling to have like real conversations about how complicated like just like and just like how complicated this is, and then also about like how like access to sports is just a human rights issue in my opinion. So I think I don't want to ascribe too much
Okay.
logic to connecting these things, but I mean I think you saw over the summer, like people like J.K. Rowling and Elon Musk were behind a lot of this, like sort of hatred and this hatred directed towards Amani Khalif, the Algerian
Right.
boxer. And I mean, for sure, those are the same people who are pushing for anti-trans policies sort of at all levels. And so I think that probably they are seeing some way of like, if we can sort of conflate these discussions all together, perhaps they see some kind of advantage. I don't really know. But I
Yeah.
do think the way that we talk about these things is often bundled up together. And I think for sure it's the same. I think the sort of backlash and the transphobia is the same across all levels of sports and
Yeah.
government. Yeah.
You said that you feel like access to sports is a human rights issue. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, so when I say that, I especially mean like I think the way that this discussion is often framed is, when we're talking about trans women and women on the intersex spectrum playing in women's sports, it's often framed as like, well, is it fair for them to play? And I think that what we need to be doing is we need to frame this as, well, is it fair to exclude them? Um,
Mm,
I just think that like rhetorically, we kind of are having these conversations from the wrong place. And to me, like I don't think it is fair to have these sort of exclusionary policies. So
yeah,
that's what I mean when I say that.
I see. As far as language goes, as you were mentioning at the beginning of this conversation, you knew what words to search for when you were looking into sort of the history in the 1930s and in different eras. With your expertise, you know what you're looking for. Were there challenges with language that came up for you as you're writing a book in 2024, given the language that was used in the 1930s? And how did you navigate that?
For sure, endless challenges. I'm still I'm still navigating it. Yeah, I mean, so I think that there are a bunch of different layers to this. I think even describing Kobek has been really tough for me because Kobek was transitioning in this era before the public had this sense of gender, this sort of like socialized psychological identity as distinct from like biological sex, which is assigned to you at birth. And so when Kobek was talking about himself, and even when he was being written about, it would often be through talking about the body. So he would talk about how, like over time, he just like felt his body becoming more and more like a man's, which
Right.
is something that was kind of a trope that you see among a lot of trans people in the 1930s, which is they would sort of frame it as like, I woke up one day and then suddenly like I had a beard, or
Right.
just
Right.
like your body had kind of changed, and that was just because that was the like easiest way to articulate to the public, like what was happening, I guess, or just like a way to like when it was hard to describe transness as an identity, you could just sort of describe the physical body. And so, Kobek at different points does reference, and including in his memoir about how he always felt more like a man. He does sort of articulate this psychological desire to be a man really from a young age. But it's like very possible that he would have fit on an intersex spectrum as well. It's just really hard to know,
Right.
especially because, and it's hard to know how he would have identified because these words of like trans and intersex as distinct, potentially, well, I guess there's overlap between those communities too, but the full sort of words that we use were not available to him. And so I've really struggled because I want to sort of, as a historian, I don't want to sort of impose too much language onto him. And then also as like sort of a person who wants these stories to connect to the present and sort of resonate in the present, it's like I do kind of want to add a label so that people, so
Yeah.
the right people know about it. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of unresolved ultimately.
How did you think about it? Like, what was your approach? Were there questions that you were asking yourself as you were working through the language? Like, if it was written like this, I could do that, or like how did you tackle it? Because I mean, you use words in the book, so like you definitely made some decisions.
Yes, we'll see if they were right decisions. Well, I think on this very simple level, like Kobek actually so when Kobek is writing about his past self, which he does at certain points in the third person kind of randomly,
Okay.
he refers to his past self using she her pronouns. I pretty quickly was just like, I don't want to do that because of just sort of like contemporary context. And so
Yeah.
that was a moment when it's like, okay, he's talking about himself this way. I don't really want to do that because that doesn't sort of fit with the way that we write today, essentially. And so there's like some moments of departure. And then when it comes to identity labels, I tried to be pretty sparing, actually, in adding too many. So I use words like queer, which didn't have the same meanings in the 1930s as they did now. I also just think queer is nice because it's pretty expansive. And I think there are moments when I refer to Kobek as approaching like a trans identity of some sort. And that was just a choice that I made just because to me that felt like the clearest articulation of what he was saying that, like I think readers could really get. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I struggle with that choice. I also think it's like you are kind of just taking a shot in the dark to some extent and being
Yeah.
like, this feels like the right choice for this book, but perhaps there's a better way to describe transness in the 1930s, or sort of different sort of forms of being on a gender spectrum in the 1930s. That, in a future edition, I can change that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that you're like so open to the changing, you know, the ways that language and identity change over time. And I think that's probably the right approach given, how much we see the changes even just within your book from how certain things are talked about in the 1930s versus how we would talk about them now. Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Valentine's Day is upon us, and I've got love on the brain. Love for books, duh, of course. Hello. Did you forget what podcast you're listening to? I love bringing you all great reads, exclusive author interviews, and behind the scenes book gossip. But I can only do that with your support over on Patreon and Substack. Our Stacks Patreon community, also known as the Stacks Pack, is where you can go for book club meetups, a private, very active Discord, and a year-long mega reading challenge to help you achieve all your reading goals. Plus, you also get that monthly bonus episode. Now, over on the Substack, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Unstacked, where I keep the book conversations going. I also give you a healthy dose of sports and pop culture, definitely some hot takes happening over there. And again, that bonus episode. If you don't have a few dollars to spare, don't worry. There are free options on the Substack and the Patreon to get you a little extra Stacks magic. Making this podcast is a total team effort, and by supporting my Patreon and my Substack, you allow me to support my amazing team that makes the show possible every single week. So if you or your friends are looking to meet other book lovers and support this indie podcast, come hang out with me on Patreon, Substack, or both. I would love to have you. And since we're talking about love, you can gift subscriptions to the Patreon and the Substack for that special reader in your life. For the Stacks Pack, head to patreon.com/thestacks. And for the newsletter, head to tracythomas.substack.com. And also, there are links to both in the show notes. Okay, see you in the Stacks. Okay, we're back. And I would like to talk a little bit about the Nazis, if that's okay. Because as I mentioned, I was in Germany and I have had a pretty much lifelong fascination with them because my parents decided it was a great idea to take me to the Holocaust Museum when I was 8.
Oh, no.
So for the last 30 years, it's been something that I've thought about. And so then for people who don't know, the 1936 Olympics were famously held in Berlin at, pre-World War II, but Hitler was in charge. It was sort of the kind of ascension of the Nazi party. It was the boots, it was the marching, it was all of those things. And this Olympics has a big impact on gender surveillance. I won't get into the whole like Avery Brundage of it all, but he's one of the reasons that it even happened there. And he's a big Nazi sympathizer, my favorite sports enemy. Some might even say he's a Nazi. I don't know. I don't want to define him for him, but I wouldn't say he's not, okay? So I would love for you to sort of explain why and how the Nazis became such a huge part of this kind of piece of history.
Yeah, for sure. I'll try not to go too far down the Avery Brundage rabbit hole. I think that's like, he's definitely part of this story. I think at a really high level, like you said, the 1936 Olympics are held in Berlin, hosted by Hitler. And, like leading up to the 1936 Olympics, there's actually this big movement, especially in the US, but in a lot of countries, to boycott the games. And there is this movement, especially on the left, especially organized by Jewish activists and anti-fascist activists, to say we're not going to send a team to the Olympics because this is just going to bolster sort of like Hitler's credentials. And basically that movement fails in large part because many members of the International Olympic Committee and then other just sort of like high up sports officials don't want that to happen, and they do want the Olympics to go on. And in fact, some of them don't really see a problem with Hitler at all. And I think that's important context because, in 1936, the Nazis are quite influential,
yes,
in sports, in the Olympics. They're not just hosting it, but they also have a lot of cachet and sway and are sort of like sending messages back and forth with all these officials from across the world, including Avery Brundage. And there are a few different sort of characters involved in this. In particular, there's this sports doctor named Wilhelm Noll, who in January 1936, he writes this op-ed, actually in kind of direct response to Kobeck, the Czech athlete who transitioned. He writes this op-ed in a sports magazine, essentially accusing Kobeck of being a fraud and seeming to assume that Kobeck is either on an intersex spectrum or is maybe just was always like a cis man, using our language. It's kind of unclear. I mean, again, you can't really ascribe too much logic to like a Nazi writing in a sports magazine. But he essentially, he used this to call for medical exams of women athletes. So although Kobeck did not want to play in women's sports after he transitioned, this sports doctor took issue with the fact that Kobeck had played in women's sports at all. And he was actually quite influential at the time. He headed this group of international sports doctors that advised the International Olympic Committee and some of these different sports federations on kind of like medical and scientific matters. And so he began agitating for these sports federations to pass policies essentially requiring like physical exams of all the women athletes who would participate, with the idea of weeding out, certain people who he did not feel fit. And actually, so Noll writes these letters to all these sports federations. He doesn't get a lot of traction, as he complains in this later op-ed where he's like, everyone ignored me except for one, which was the Track and Field Federation. And basically the International Olympic Committee is this kind of overarching governing body of the Olympics. And then more specific policies are often set by federations that govern a group of sports. So track and field, swimming. So basically everyone except for the Track and Field Federation ignored Noll, this sports doctor. This is also what I mean where it's none of this was inevitable. In the 1936, you have the Track and Field Federation kind of takes up Noll's request, and in August 1936 passes this really vaguely worded rule about doing physical exams of women athletes where there's a question of gender, essentially. And that's really the origins of sex testing and gender surveillance policies. That's the first time that we see on this international level a policy dictating which women would be allowed to play, and actually calling for a direct examination of certain women. Notably, they never really wrestled with the fact that, the human body is a big spectrum, not to mention sort of gender being a spectrum. We don't even need to go there, but just none of this was sort of discussed in the policy that was passed in 1936. And I do think it really is in large part because this was a moment of sort of fascism on the upswing, and it just seemed perfectly logical, I think, to a lot of these sports officials that, of course, we would try to eliminate certain kinds of women just kind of wholesale from these sports. And also, we don't even have to get too much into this, but all these, the people passing these policies were all men. And they were all men who largely opposed women's sports itself. In
general, yeah.
Yes, they did not want women to play. They were constantly limiting, especially women track and field athletes. So it's this group of men who think there's no point in women playing sports, think it's actually dangerous for women to play sports. These are the same men who are then passing the policy that's saying only certain women are allowed to play.
Right. Just a personal question for you. How much into sports are you? Are you a sports person? Were you a sports person before the book? Did this change your relationship to sports?
Yeah, great question. I have to say that I'm not a huge sports person.
Okay, that's okay.
I've watched lots of footage now sort of for the book, and I've always watched the Olympics. But Yeah, I think that I'm always fascinated by the politics of a bureaucracy, and I think sports bureaucracies are extremely weird and wild,
Yeah.
and
Especially Olympics
especially the
ones.
Olympics.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. It's
And
so
so, yeah.
crazy.
And just like so like watching the Olympics, I'm really just like, oh, I think I just like know too much about how all of this works, how messy the behind the scenes is. I just like kind of got obsessed with like sort of the sort of structural elements of sports and the bureaucratic elements of sports. I'm not unfortunately streaming sports on a weekly basis, but
That's okay. I was
that's
just
yeah.
curious. I was just curious, like your relationship to the actual like athletics of it. I'm also curious, what were, if any, sort of big surprises for you as you were researching and writing the book? Were there things where you were like, holy shit, like did not see this coming?
Maybe I've kind of spoiled like some of the bigger surprises by sort of mentioning them earlier. I mean, honestly, like this article about Kobeck in the magazine Physical Culture, this big sports magazine, was really striking to me early in the research just because it's a sports magazine talking about like, hey, like, I mean, they didn't say gender is a spectrum, but like there was talking about how like male and female like categories are imperfect. A sports magazine in the 1930s. That was quite striking. There was also this magazine called Sexology in the 1930s that I read a lot of issues of. It was basically this like general interest publication about sex in the body and talking about everything from, like masturbation to like marital problems to sexual problems, whatever, kind of the whole gamut. And it was really one of the only places because it had this lens of science, although sometimes they publish pseudoscience, but like it had this lens of science. And so it was one of the main places that, like the American public could read about sex and ask questions about sex in a really honest way in the 1930s. And they had this letters to the editor section, which, separately, some really wild questions were being asked in
I
this
can
letters to
only
the editor
imagine.
section.
As soon as you said letters to the editor, I
Oh
was
my
like,
gosh.
where's
I
this
read 10
going?
years of this and I was like, these people are crazy.
Some things
But
never change.
some things
Letters
never
to the
change.
editor is where the craziest of humanity likes to show up with pen and
Yes.
paper.
Yes. Well, and then sometimes there's some beautiful things in there. And
Yes.
so one thing that really just struck me is that, so Sexology wrote a piece about Kobeck and Weston transitioning, trying to sort of like explain to their audience, like, well, maybe you've heard this news story about these athletes. Like, what does it actually mean scientifically? And in response, they got so many letters from people who wanted to know more about how a transition was possible. People who,
Mm,
probably would identify as trans today, who are saying, like, I see myself in these athletes and like, is there a doctor I can go to? Like, how do I find out more about
right.
this? They received so many letters to the editor that they wrote a follow-up article where they were just sort of like, what's going on? Why is everyone trying to do this? And they quoted some of the letters they received. And so this follow-up, I think, was published in 1937. This is a bunch of people writing in being like, I see myself in this athlete and I too want to like talk to a doctor about this, get access to some of this sort of like medical care. And that really just struck me because it's so hard to find the voices of queer people in the archive sometimes, especially in like, like newspapers and magazines. Like you really have to be creative. In the 1930s, we didn't have like an openly gay publication of any kind,
Right. Right.
And so it's like those little glimmers of like what these stories, what these athletes might have meant to the wider queer community. And I thought that was really incredible to come across.
That's so cool. And how were the athletes transitioning? I know you write about it a little bit in the book, but if you want to just give us a little taste.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly like kind of hard to untangle because I mean, the way that, especially for Kobeck, he writes quite vaguely about it. Kobeck had two different surgeries that he alluded to. And it's also possible and maybe likely that he was taking some kind of like early hormone, although he didn't say that. So it's a little bit hard to know. I would say,
Unclear.
yeah, all these athletes went to see doctors, which itself was quite fraught just because a lot of these doctors were also eugenicists,
Right.
and would only like give, it's like you're really fighting against the system and would only give medical care. Often if you were white, often if, after you transition, you would be read as heterosexual. So yeah, it was a hard system, but they didn't get into too much detail, I guess is just
Got it.
what I would say. But I would not be surprised, and probably expect it's like an interplay of surgery and hormones.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned earlier, and forgot to ask you this follow up, which I think is important, though I also think I know the answer, but I just want to get it on the record. Because I'm a journalist, obviously. um, but with the Nazi doctor who was like writing the op-ed and doing all the things that led to the gender surveillance of women athletes, it did not lead to gender surveillance of the male athletes, correct?
Yeah, there's never been like any kind of sex testing policy for male athletes at the Olympics.
I mean, that's got to just be like the most sexist shit ever, right? Like that's just based on the idea that like men are better than women at sports, and like if a woman or a trans man wants to try, like good luck beating Jesse Owens or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also just tied to the fact that, like, I mean, an extension of that misogyny, the fact that women's sports were incredibly scrutinized and still are throughout its whole history at the Olympics in a way that men's sports were not. The fact that, like, there has been like 100-year battle for there to be enough women's sports at the Olympics,
Right.
that like women's sports have always been under the microscope and women athletes sort of exponentially under the microscope at the Olympics. So, yeah.
Okay, this is actually, before we do the hard shifts, can you talk a little bit about the title and the cover of the book with us?
So first of all, I really love the book cover, and I had basically
I
nothing
do
to
too.
do with it.
It's so good,
Yeah,
though. I love it so much.
but it made me really happy to see. It's like kind of like in like a vintage 1930s like magazine style, which I really loved and thought was so genius. But again, can't had nothing to do with that.
Who was your cover designer?
It was June Park,
Oh, amazing. Amazing. Well, it is so gorgeous. And that's Kobek on the cover.
and that is Quebec, yes. Sort of in midair,
Yeah.
which was really cool.
And then what about the title? Was that always a title? Did it change? Where did it come from?
The title, to be honest, the main title, The Other Olympians, just sounded kind of good. Although a lot of people have pointed out to me that have asked if it's a reference to this really iconic book, The Other Victorians,
Oh,
which I was not originally a reference, but I kind of like want to like retroactively um,
okay.
make it a reference. The Other Victorians is about like homosexuality in the Victorian era.
I see.
So I'm gonna just sort of say that it would be cool if that were true, but it
I like
unfortunately
this.
wasn't.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, I'm a serious journalist, and so this is on the record. So
Yeah.
if you'd like to set the record
Yeah.
straight right now, you can do that.
Yeah, I can't reverse quarterback it. It just sounded good ultimately.
Okay. Okay. Is there anything that's not in the book that you wish was or could have been?
Yeah, there was this whole sort of section about actually another Nazi, this really prominent woman athlete named Violette Morris, who was a French woman who was really one of the most famous, like, kind of like women athletes in the world in the early 1920s, who was this like big kind of like butch woman who actually got a mastectomy in the 1920s and caused a lot of scandal in French society because of that. And so, like there's a section early in the book that I eventually just cut that talked about her and about how all of this kind of like gender panic around her, like getting different kinds of like cosmetic surgeries to her body was sort of like, in some ways, like anticipated different sort of anti-trans and anti-intersex rhetoric that was to come. And then she also, like, if you read the book Bad Gays, you might know that like she later becomes a Nazi and sort of collaborates with the Nazis during the Nazi occupation of France. So I thought like her arc was really interesting because I do think it kind of dovetails with this like rise of fascism. I don't know, it deals with a lot. Ultimately, it was just sort of too much to include her too. There are a lot of characters in this book. There are a lot of people in this book. But I think, and also like people have written about her story a fair bit, and a lot of these other athletes haven't really gotten much airtime at all. But I do think it would have been cool. But I made the choice to cut it, so I'm solely responsible for that. For better or for worse.
I love that you're owning this. You're like, I cut that Nazi out of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, she wasn't that inspiring. It's like if someone had to go, it had to be her.
Had to be her. Okay, let's talk a little bit about your process. I always love to ask people this. How do you write? How many hours a day? How often? Where are you? Snacks and beverages, rituals, sort of set the scene. Tell us how the magic happens.
Yeah, wow, I wish I was so consistent because I feel like a lot of authors are sort of like, I wake up at 6 a.m. and then I write for 4 hours, then I'm done for the day. I don't really have that.
It's okay. I've been doing the show for now like 7 years, and a lot of people do that. And then a lot of people are like, I wish I did that, but actually, so don't
Yeah.
worry.
Well, I wrote a lot of this book while I was working a copywriting job, a remote copywriting job. I think they won't be listening to this, so I'll just say that like I would be working sort of
Mhm.
when when I'd have Slack open and when I felt like
Mhm.
no one needed anything from me, I would,
Mhm.
toggle
Mhm.
over to the Word document. So it was
I
more
see.
like kind of a bunch of stolen moments.
Got it. And why would you think that they wouldn't be listening to this podcast? It's like probably like one of the biggest podcasts in
So
the
true.
history of.
If
It's like
only,
me,
yeah,
and then Joe Rogan's right under. So like they're probably listening.
it's so true. Well, I'm really sorry if so. Um, but yeah, and like I mean, I really like to work. Like I work listening to like almost always listening to music, which I think some people find crazy. Like I will listen to club music. I don't really know why.
Oh, okay.
I just do think that's like something like gets me a little animated and focused. I also love to be at a coffee shop. And just there's something about like a lot of noise around you, like noise in my ears, that like really lets me like lock in. Like it really feels
Mhm.
like I'm like in this space. Whereas sometimes when I'm home trying to write, it is kind of just like I'm like looking around, I'm like looking for something going
Yeah.
on. And I think in public it's much more like I can lock in. It really is kind of just like whenever I have the time and the inspiration. I also do a lot of writing on my phone, so I like
Okay.
will like write on the subway sometimes on my phone. Just because if I get sometimes the Word document is stressful to look at, and then it's like okay, let me just type this into the Notes app, even into iMessage, and just send to myself, and that's like a way
Yeah.
of like I don't know, just like taking some of the stakes away from it and just like getting something out that has been hard to get out.
And when you go to a coffee shop to work, what snacks and beverages are you partaking in?
I am getting okay. I love a Danish. Often my
Okay.
order will be like some form of Danish and a large black coffee because I'm always a little sleepy. So,
Okay.
um,
And is there a favorite Danish kind? Like if you go to the shop and they have X, Y, and Z Danish, or like it is my lucky day.
there's one place near me that has a really good cherry Danish, which I think is kind of a curveball. I
Ooh.
don't see many cherry
Okay.
Danishes anywhere else. I
Uh-uh.
really am a fan of that. That's
Okay.
Mia's
And where are
Bakery.
you located? New York?
I'm in New York. I'm in Brooklyn. So the cherry
Okay.
Danish is from Mia's Bakery. If anyone is
Okay.
local, I love that spot.
Shout
Um,
out. Mia's MIA.
MIA, yeah.
Shout out to Mia and her Danish, her
Yeah.
cherry Danish. All right. What comes next for you? Do you have another book idea? Are you thinking in that world? Is there another piece of queer history that scrambles the timeline that you're super excited about? Can you tell us anything?
Yes. Although it's not exactly queer history. So
Okay.
this is gonna sound like a curveball, but yeah,
I love a curveball.
I'm writing another history book about sort of the history of credit surveillance in America and sort of about like
Oh,
everything leading up until modern credit scoring. And so, I think the connective tissue is I've been saying to friends it's 10% gay. Like the gay activist movement and also sort of like the Black Power movement, the feminist movement, are all the welfare rights movement were all sort of like big parts of trying to challenge the credit system in the 1960s and 70s. And I think sort of these efforts to unroll it failed in interesting ways. But yeah, it's like a book that is looking at like how did we get to this place where we have three credit bureaus and this sort of private company that creates this algorithm that decides sort of our financial worth and value and our
right.
employability and whether or not we can rent an apartment. And it's a wild story that goes back to 1899. So the book is
Whoa.
like a history of just like how we got here and how like efforts to dismantle the system.
Oh my gosh. Okay, wait, but the other connective tissue is the surveillance.
For sure. Okay, that's actually didn't think about that. Great framing.
Okay, thank you. Is it with Jackson? Is he your editor still?
Yes,
Oh my
exactly.
God. I'm such a fan. I didn't really know who he was. And then I started reading these books and they all had him as the editor. And I was like, wait a second. Are you a celebrity now for me? Because I feel like that. And then I got to meet him at the National Book Awards and I was like, I'm a big fan of yours.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jackson Howard, rising star at FSG, or already a star. I don't know, star in my heart. But that book sounds amazing. And I want to ask you questions about it, but I'm not going to. I'm going to stick to this one. Just a few more for you. Who was the coolest person in your eyes that was excited or expressed interest in the book?
Ooh, there are a lot of people that really excited me. Like Susan Stryker, who's this really iconic historian of trans history, like blurbed the book, which was so kind and like it was so thrilling early on, just because I read her book Transgender History, which is like kind of like a classic in the field when I was in high school.
Mm,
It was one of the books that really got me into doing queer history and sort of understanding how many stories are out there.
yeah.
So that was just like truly a thrill. And I also, I sent the book to Chris Mosier, who's this Olympic athlete who really advocates for trans athletes at the Olympics and in general. And he was really kind about it too. You know, there are a lot of little things like that. But I think that the moment early on when Susan Stryker read it, I was like,
Oh
that's
my
so
gosh, that's
thrilling.
great. I love that. Okay, for people who love the other Olympians, what are some other books you might recommend to them that are in conversation with your work?
Good question. I would say there's like maybe two different strands that I could answer this with, because I think there's certain queer history books that like at least I was thinking a lot about as I was writing. I don't know if
Yeah.
I would like deign to say I'm in conversation with them. I was reading a lot of the work of Jules Gill Peterson as I was writing this. She has multiple books about queer history and trans history and about sort of like the makings of this idea of gender. And I think she's just like such a brilliant historian. And so I was really thinking about her work as I was writing this. There's also this book called How Sex Changed that was published in the early 2000s, and like just is a really full recounting of like how Americans thought about like gender and sex over time. And then I think the narrative history books, there's like a lot of incredible narrative history books that I was reading and sort of like thinking over in my head as I was writing this. I really love this book, How to Hide an Empire, which is about like it's basically like about the history of American imperialism and colonialism. It's really, it like does the incredible thing of like rescuing all of these somewhat obscure stories about like, like where like the word bikini comes from, that like intersect in all these ways with American culture, and also rooted in different ways in like colonial oppression. It's just like one of those
Whoa.
books where it's like every page I was like, that's so crazy, I didn't know that. The first thing in that book that stood out to me is that in the introduction it talks about how during the bombings at Pearl Harbor, there was also a bombing in the US occupied Philippines at the time, which FDR intentionally erased from mentioning because Americans didn't realize that they had colonized the Philippines essentially. And he thought that would be inconvenient in his speech about the Pearl Harbor
Wow.
bombing. So it's like, it's filled with stuff like that where I'm like, I had no idea.
Oh my gosh,
So
that
that's
sounds
How to Hide an
amazing.
Empire. Um,
Okay.
and there are a bunch more, but I could just kind of leave it there.
Okay, well, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding that to my list. But you're right, because your book is like a queer history, but also this like narrative history, just more broadly, which is aside from like investigative journalism, is probably my like second favorite kind of book, like a history book that has like a narrative arc and has like these figures that you can sort of follow and like get to know. And it's done so. I mean, you did it so well. I already said it. It's like one of my favorite books from last year. I love it, but you do that so well of getting the history really clearly in the book, but also giving us sort of like a story to follow. So it doesn't necessarily feel like you're reading like dry history, which I also like, but not as much as narrative. Okay. Normally, I only ask this question once a month to my guest who does book club with me. But because this episode airs on January 22nd, 2 days after the administration has changed over, and because you've written a book about a topic that is just like political catnip right now, if you could require the current president of the United States, current as of January 20th, so as people are listening, if you could require the current president of the United States to read one book, what would it be?
Well, I don't think anything is going to change his mind at this point, and I also don't really think he's going to read this book. But I guess the book that comes to mind for me is this academic book called "Sex Is as Sex Does" by Paisley Currah, who is this really incredible scholar. And basically, this book is talking about like essentially how governments have come to define sex and sort of about like construct these ideas of sex. And it's really about like the ways in which different political concerns filter down into, like DMV policies, for instance. It's a really thoughtful book. Another book that I read a lot and thought about a lot as I was writing my own book. I think it's also just for anyone who is like sort of thinking about how bureaucracies work and especially how they affect trans and intersex people. It's really incredible. I don't think Donald Trump would ever read it, and I don't think he cares about any of this stuff.
Yeah.
But,
this is a thought exercise.
It's a thought exercise. I think other people should read it. It's called Sex is as Sex Does. And yeah, it's actually mentioned at kind of like the ending author's note in my book as well. It's really like the theory behind that book really framed a lot of this for me.
I love that. Okay, last question, Michael. If you could have one person, dead or alive, read this book, who would you want it to be?
Ooh, this is maybe a cop-out answer, but I really would love for Kobek, the main athlete in this book, to read it, because I think that I don't know that he would like this book. Jury's out.
Okay.
But I think I spent a lot of time reading his sort of memoir while researching, and he's a very funny guy. He's also like kind of a hater and a cynic, which, it's kind of a storied gay tradition. And I think he would be really funny to talk about this book with, even if he doesn't like it. I think he would be really cutting in a way I would kind of enjoy. And I think we would have like fun banter about it.
That's a great answer. And we're going to get out of here on that. Everyone at home, you can get your copy of The Other Olympians wherever books are sold. You can also request it from your library. If they don't have it, you can tell them to get it. I loved this book so much. I hope people read it. It is so engaging and also informative and just like a wild story. And as I mentioned, there are heroes, there are Nazis, there's my personal enemy, Avery Brundage. Like, what else do you need in a book? Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really so much fun.
Oh, good. And everyone else, we will see you in the stacks. All right, y'all, that does it for us today. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you again to Michael Waters for being my guest. Don't forget, the Stacks Book Club pick for January is The Ministry of Time by Cullianne Bradley. Jay Wortham will be back to discuss the book with us on Wednesday, January 29th. If you love the show and you want inside access to it, you can head to patreon.com/thestacks to join the Stacks Pack. And you can check out my newsletter at tracythomas.substack.com. Make sure you're subscribed to the Stacks wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're listening through Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a rating and a review. For more from the Stacks, follow us on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. And you can check out our website at thestackspodcast.com. This episode of The Stacks was edited by Christian Duenas with production assistance from Megan Caballero. Our graphic designer is Robin McCrite, and our theme music is from Tegirigis. The Stacks is created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas.